It was just past dusk when the last train pulled away from the dirt-stained platform of Bitter Creek Station. The town sat still, quiet like it always was after the mail sacks were offloaded and the few passengers either gathered up by wagons or wandered toward the saloon with shoulders slumped low. The wind dragged across the empty tracks, stirring dust that hadn't felt rain in weeks. On the edge of the platform, under the flickering yellow glow of a single oil lamp, sat a woman who didn't move when the train screeched off into the distance. She hadn't moved for hours. Tanner Thatcher leaned on the hitch rail near his horse, arms crossed tight, jaw clenched. He didn't much like being in town, never had. Folks talked too much here, asked things he didn't want to answer. But his brother's widow had sent word about a new ranch hand needing escort to Cedar Rock. That was the only reason he'd ridden in from his place near the basin. He hadn't expected to see her. Hell, no one did. She looked like someone God had stopped halfway through remaking. One side of her face was untouched, fair, young, eyes steady and too quiet. The other was scarred up something awful. The burns ran down past her jaw, skin tight and uneven like melted wax. People avoided looking at her. The station clerk kept glancing, like he was hoping she'd disappear before someone asked who'd left her there. Tanner watched her without moving, arms still crossed. She didn't notice him, or she did and didn't care. Either way, her spine stayed straight, hands folded in her lap like she was just another woman waiting for someone to come pick her up. But it was too late for that train, and too late for pretending she belonged anywhere normal. She didn't have a bag, just a small tin box tucked between her boots. Her shoes were city-worn, scuffed at the heels, cracked down the sides. One sole looked like it was coming apart. Her dress was clean, blue with a faded white collar. Someone had tried to take care of her once, but that had been a while ago. Now she sat there like a woman who'd come to the end of something and hadn't quite figured out if she'd keep breathing past it. Tanner narrowed his eyes, his fingers twitching against the worn leather of his gloves. The wind lifted a piece of her dark hair, revealing the mess where the skin had turned red and raw along her neck. She didn't flinch, didn't pull her collar up. She let the wind take what it wanted. The clerk finally gave up and shut the station window, turning the lock without saying a word to her. That told Tanner everything he needed. No one was coming for her. She wasn't waiting. She was hiding. He pushed off the rail. His boots scraped against the boards as he walked up to her slow. He didn't speak right away. She looked up, startled, eyes narrowing, maybe expecting another set of cruel words. Tanner didn't give her any, just stood there, looking down on her face, both sides of it, and nodded once like he'd seen worse things and didn't need explanations. "You're coming with me," he said. The way her eyes flinched, just a fraction, it told him she wasn't used to kindness that sounded like orders. She didn't move. She didn't speak. He crouched beside her, arms resting on his knees. Up close, her skin looked hot, like the burns still hurt when the air touched them. He didn't ask how she got them. That would come later, or maybe never. People talked too much about pain, like it was owed to someone else. "You got a name?" he asked. She shook her head once, almost like she didn't know or didn't want to tell him. He stared at her quiet. "Fine, you can ride without one." She looked away then, not scared, not angry, just empty. He stood and motioned with a jerk of his chin. "You stay here. Folks are going to let you ride." Her voice, when it came, was small, flat. "That's fine." Tanner looked out past the station to where the desert stretched like a graveyard no one bothered to bury. "It ain't." She hesitated, then slowly reached for her tin box, pressing it against her chest like it held the only part of her life worth keeping. She stood, stiff and unsure, and for the first time he noticed the limp. Her right leg dragged a little, probably healed wrong, probably hadn't been treated at all. He didn't ask. They walked in silence to the horse. He helped her mount, careful not to touch her skin too long, careful not to let her fall. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect it. Gratitude felt too close to apology, and folks like her had nothing to be sorry for. They rode under the bleeding sunset, the sky burning down over the land like it was trying to mirror the scars on her face. Tanner didn't speak again for hours, and neither did she. But she didn't try to get down either. That was enough. By the time they reached the rise where his cabin came into view, her body had slumped a little against his back. Not asleep, but tired enough to lean. The wind had died down, and the night was cold. He nudged the horse forward. Behind him, she held tighter. He didn't know what she was running from. Not yet. But he knew she wasn't going back. Whatever burned her, whatever left her at that station alone, had meant to finish her off. It hadn't. And maybe that was the beginning. Or maybe it was just the middle of a long story no one ever wanted to tell. Either way, Tanner wasn't letting her go. The cabin sat low in the valley, half sunk into a ridge where the wind couldn't claw so hard. It wasn't much. Single room, rough-hewn timber walls, a lean-to on the side that served as a barn. But it was quiet, and no one came out that far unless they had business with Tanner Thatcher, which meant no one came at all. The woman didn't speak for 2 days. Not when he brought her warm water, not when he left food on the small table beside the cot he cleared for her, and not when he told her where the outhouse was. She moved slowly, carefully, always with her arms tucked in like she expected something to fly at her. Still, she cleaned the dishes when he cooked, folded her own blanket in the morning, and never touched a thing that wasn't hers. He didn't push her. He just started calling her Junie. One morning, after watching her stare too long at the steam curling off a cup of coffee. It sounded soft, like something broken, but still good. She didn't say whether it was right or not. But the next morning, when he handed her a tin plate with bread and eggs, she whispered, "Thank you." That was the first time her voice didn't sound dead. It was midweek when he brought her out to the pasture. His horse had gotten caught in barbed wire the day before, and he needed help wrapping a leg. Junie didn't ask questions, just followed him out, face hidden beneath a bonnet she'd found in a box of old things near the stove. She moved with care, the limp more visible on uneven ground. Tanner kept glancing back at her, but didn't offer help unless she asked. When they reached the animal, she knelt slowly, hands surprisingly steady as she pressed cloth to the bleeding skin. The horse didn't flinch. Neither did she. Tanner watched her out of the corner of his eye. She wasn't just someone who'd survived fire. She was someone who'd handled pain before, and not just her own. He asked then, "You ever work with horses?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "My uncle raised them." Still around, Junie didn't look up. No, she didn't say more. He didn't ask. By the third week, Tanner's neighbor showed up uninvited. Roy Callahan, bigger man, louder man, and not someone who knew how to keep to himself. He came riding up with his boy, Tommy, trailing behind like a shadow that didn't want to be there. "Thatcher," Roy called from his saddle, boots already halfway to the dirt before Tanner could say anything. "Heard you took in a stranger." Tanner stepped out onto the porch, wiping grease off his hands. Junie stayed inside. She always did when strangers came near. "I didn't ask for company," Tanner said flat. Roy spat to the side and grinned like he owned every inch between their boots. "Just looking out for you, friend. Folks in town are curious. Woman shows up with half a face burned off, no name, no kin, you gotta admit, that ain't usual." Tanner stared him down. "You came here to gossip? I came here to remind you this ain't the kind of land where people forget things easy." Roy squinted, especially when a woman like that turns up. Behind the curtain, Junie watched, her hands clenched tight around the edge of the window. Roy chuckled, but it didn't sound kind. "You sure she's not some outlaw's wife? Or worse?" Tanner didn't answer. Didn't need to. He stepped forward just enough to make Roy shift his weight. Tommy, the boy, was watching Junie through the window too. Caught her eyes for half a second before she disappeared back into the shadows. Roy eventually left, but the warning stuck, and Tanner knew it wouldn't be the last time someone came snooping. The days stretched thin after that. Junie started helping more, feeding the chickens, patching his saddle strap that had torn during a storm. She worked in silence, her motions careful, clean, but her eyes watched everything. Tanner noticed it one morning while she scrubbed the porch floor with a rag and bucket. how she paused each time a rider passed the far ridge. She was always listening, always measuring. She knew someone was coming. It was Tanner's sister, Agnes, who first said something plain. She came by after 2 months, bringing a bag of cornmeal and a jug of cider like she always did when checking in. Her boots hit the steps with purpose, and her eyes caught Junie immediately. Agnes didn't stare at the burns, just at the way Junie kept her body small in the corner of the porch. After pleasantries, she pulled Tanner aside and hissed low, "Who is she? Does it matter?" Agnes folded her arms. "It matters if someone's looking for her." Tanner kept his voice steady. "Maybe someone is. Maybe they shouldn't find her." Agnes narrowed her eyes. "You always did taking things with broken wings." "She's not broken." Agnes glanced back at Junie. "Then what's she hiding?" Tanner didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he had a feeling Junie was still figuring that out herself. That night, Junie came to him while he was mending the fence by lamplight. She stood there for a long while before speaking. "He was a preacher," she said, voice hollow. "My husband." Tanner didn't move. "He told people I fell asleep with the lamp burning. Said I spilled it. That was my fault." Tanner set the hammer down. Junie looked off into the dark. "But he did it. He always said I talked too much. So he made sure I never would again." The silence between them stretched like something breaking open. "Why'd you come here?" he asked. "Because no one would think to look for me where a man like you lives alone." Tanner didn't flinch. "Smart." Junie finally turned her head toward him. "But they will. If Roy Callahan starts talking too loud in town. I'll take care of Roy." She stared hard at him. "I don't want you to get burned for me." He met her eyes. "Then don't run." She didn't promise, but she didn't leave. Secrets had a way of hanging in the air out there. They didn't vanish. They just waited for the wrong wind to stir them up again. And Tanner could feel the air shifting. The girl with no name was building trust, maybe even finding pieces of herself again. But someone, somewhere, still held the match that lit her life on fire. And men like Roy Callahan made it their business to pass that flame around. Trouble was coming. But for now, Junie stayed. And Tanner kept watch. The rain came fast, sweeping down from the foothills in sheets that turned the dirt to slick clay and made the roof of the cabin groan under its weight. Tanner stood at the edge of the porch, soaked to the elbows, his jaw tight. Junie was inside, rocking in the old chair near the hearth, a book open but unread in her lap. Something had changed in her over the last few weeks. Her shoulders not as hunched, her eyes meeting his now without flinching. But that peace hung by a thread. It started with a letter. Agnes brought it. She arrived one morning early, her cheeks red from the wind, holding an envelope she hadn't dared open. "This was nailed to the church door," she told Tanner. "Just your name. No return address." Tanner didn't read it right away. He waited until night, when Junie had gone to bed and the fire was dying low. The letter was written in tight, careful script. No greeting, just a warning. "You're hiding someone that belongs to me. She took something. I will take it back." No name, no signature, but Tanner didn't need either. He burned the letter after reading it 3 times. The next morning, Junie found him at the barn and said nothing, but she saw the ash in the stove and the way he wouldn't meet her eye. Her mouth tightened, and she said in that soft, raw voice of hers, "He found me, didn't he?" Tanner said nothing, but she already knew. That day, everything shifted. Tanner started sleeping with his rifle leaned against the bedpost. He double-checked the latch on a back door, and he kept his horse saddled at night, just in case they needed to ride fast. Junie noticed all of it, but didn't speak. Instead, she started practicing with the small pistol he'd given her weeks earlier, the one she'd refused to touch before. She didn't hold it like someone afraid. She held it like someone who knew what it meant to use one and didn't want to need to. The next sign came quiet. Tommy Callahan, Roy's boy, rode over alone one morning. Said he was there to borrow a fence mender. But his voice was tight, nervous. His hands fidgeted with the reins like he didn't know what to do with himself. "Tommy," Tanner said, watching him, "what's your pa up to?" Tommy froze, swallowed hard. I think he wrote that letter, the boy blurted, eyes wide. He's been meeting with someone. A stranger. Real clean boots, expensive hat. Saw him ride out 2 nights ago toward the canyon. Tanner tensed. A stranger meant trouble. Meant the man who burned Junie's face might not be far now. You didn't tell him you came here, right? Tommy shook his head. No, sir. Tanner nodded once. Good. Tommy left fast, glancing back twice. Junie stood at the barn, half-shadowed, watching everything. That night, she told Tanner the rest. Her name wasn't Junie. It was Margaret June Ashby. Her husband, Reverend Elijah Ashby, was a man beloved in 3 counties, delivered sermons that made people cry and give up liquor and kneel in sawdust pews. But behind closed doors, he was a devil. He didn't just hurt her. He destroyed her. And when she tried to run, he locked her in the house and lit a match. But she didn't die. A neighbor found her half dead in a ditch, and she fled before he could tell the town. She took nothing except the tin box, the one she kept close even while she slept. Tanner had never asked what was in it. Until now. She opened it that night. Inside were 5 letters, all written by other women. Each described what Elijah had done to them. Margaret had found them by accident, in a drawer in his study, hidden under a false bottom. Some dated years back. All the women signed their names. Most were young. 2 had been his parish house helpers. One was only 16. They were dead by the time I found the letters, she whispered, her voice shaking for the first time in weeks. He made sure of it. Tanner stared at her, his gut turning cold. You're going to give them to someone? He asked. She nodded. The sheriff in Elwood. But I didn't make it that far. That was the twist of it. The thing that flipped everything upside down. Junie wasn't just a woman running from pain. She was a witness, holding the only proof that could bring down a man who still wore a collar and quoted the good book. That meant he'd never stop hunting her. Not while those letters still existed. And now Roy Callahan had made a deal. Maybe for money. Maybe for favor. Either way, someone was coming. 3 days later, someone set fire to Tanner's barn. It happened after midnight. Flames snapped loud enough to wake both of them. And by the time they burst out the front door, the sky was orange. The horses were screaming. Tanner grabbed a bucket, but it was useless. The fire had started inside. Junie didn't cry. She stood barefoot in the yard, dress clinging wet to her legs from the rain that had just started to fall again, clutching that tin box tight. The way her eyes locked on the ridge told Tanner she knew who had done it. In the morning, Tanner found boot tracks circling back through the trees behind the barn. He followed them part way and found a piece of torn cloth snagged on the fence, black wool. Expensive. He came back with dirt on his boots and murder in his heart. I'm riding to Elwood, Junie said as he stepped into the cabin. Tanner turned, jaw clenched. You leave now. You won't make it 2 miles. I can't stay, she said. You'll lose everything trying to protect me. He stepped closer. You're not leaving. We're going together. But on my terms. She stared at him. Then something inside her cracked. I should have died in that house. He shook his head. You didn't. And now he's going to pay for that. By nightfall, Tanner had packed food, wrapped the letters in oilcloth, and saddled the horse. They would leave before dawn. Junie didn't argue. But the world doesn't wait for plans to settle. At midnight, they heard a voice. Elijah Ashby. Open up. Now a demand. A statement. Junie froze in the doorway. Tanner raised his rifle and moved to the front window. A single man stood under the moonlight, calm, hands open. He wore a long black coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and boots that looked like they'd never seen dust. His face was pale. Cold. It's him, Junie whispered. Tanner didn't hesitate. He stepped out, rifle aimed at the man's chest. You take one more step. I'm not here for blood. The man interrupted, voice calm. I'm here for what belongs to me. Tanner spit on the ground. She's not yours. Elijah's eyes glinted. You think you're protecting her? You're just prolonging the inevitable. She's a liar. A thief. Funny, Tanner said, that all your lies are signed by girls who ain't breathing no more. Elijah's smile twitched. Burn the letters, and I walk away. Tanner raised the rifle. That offer dies here. Elijah's eyes moved past him to the cabin. You don't have a nerve. A shot rang out. It wasn't Tanner. It came from inside the cabin. Elijah stumbled back, his coat splitting near the shoulder. Junie stood in the doorway, pistol shaking in her hands. Smoke rose from the barrel. Tanner turned just in time to see Elijah vanish into the brush. He didn't go down, but he bled. Junie collapsed to her knees, guns slipping from her grip. Tanner rushed to her. You hit him. He won't come back easy now. She trembled but nodded. Then let's finish this. The fire, the letter, the man in the dark coat. Everything had led to this moment. There was no turning back. No going quiet. They'd ride for Elwood in the morning. And this time, she wouldn't run. She would testify. The trail to Elwood was narrow and winding, carved through low hills and thorn-choked brush. Tanner and Junie rode side by side beneath a dull gray sky, the silence between them growing heavier with each mile. She gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles, the tin box wrapped in cloth and strapped tight to her chest. He could feel her shaking even through the layers she wore. They'd left behind more than just a cabin. They'd left the last safe place Junie had known, and now they rode straight into the fire. By the second day, her face was pale and drawn. The wound of Elijah's voice, that terrible, familiar calm, echoed in her bones. She hadn't slept the night before. Tanner had heard her breathing catch in the dark, the way she curled in on herself with her hand on the pistol beneath her blanket. She never cried. Not once. That was the worst of it. The pain was buried too deep for tears now. They made camp under a rocky bluff where the wind cut bitter through the trees. Tanner got the fire going, but Junie didn't sit near it. She paced, back and forth, like her body couldn't stand still because her mind wouldn't stop racing. You think he's following us? She asked suddenly. Tanner looked up. He's wounded. He'll slow down. Junie didn't answer. She just stared off into the trees. You're not the same woman I found at that station, Tanner said, trying to anchor her. You've come too far to go quiet now. She looked at him, her eyes hollow. That's the problem. I'm not the same. I don't even know who I am anymore. He stood and crossed to her. You're Margaret June Ashby. You survived a fire meant to kill you. You carry truth in that box, and you're walking into the town that can finally hear it. That's who you are. Her voice cracked. And if they don't believe me, Tanner didn't flinch. Then I make them listen. But even as he spoke, he felt it, the weight of what they were risking. Elijah wasn't just any man. He was respected, connected. His sermons were still printed in small papers across the region. He had friends with influence, men who didn't care what he did behind closed doors as long as he shook their hands in public. If Junie failed, if the sheriff didn't listen, Elijah would make her vanish. He'd done it before. And Tanner? He'd burned for standing by her. By the third night, things got worse. They stopped at a watering hole, low and muddy from drought. While Tanner led the horses down, Junie waited beneath a patch of mesquite. He heard a rustle, then a sharp cry. He ran up the bank, rifle raised. Junie stood frozen, her pistol in her hand, pointed at a man on horseback. Roy Callahan. He had his hands up, but his mouth was twisted in a sneer. Well, now, he drawled. Ain't you two riding quiet? Tanner moved between them. You got 10 seconds to turn around. Roy didn't move. You think they're going to believe her? You think Elwood Sheriff will arrest a preacher with friends on the judge's bench? Tanner's grip tightened. What are you doing here? Following orders, Roy said. The Reverend pays well. Promise me the ranch, the East Valley, and a nice little title if I help bring her in. Dead or alive. Junie didn't move. Didn't breathe. Tanner raised his rifle. You'll leave with a bullet if you don't ride now. For a second, Roy looked like he might take the shot. But something in Tanner's face made him pause. Then he laughed. This won't end well for either of you. He turned his horse and rode off into the dusk. That night, Junie didn't sleep again, and Tanner's nerves frayed to the edge. They were running out of time. When they reached Elwood on the 5th day, the town looked quiet, almost too normal. But Junie's back straightened as soon as she saw the church steeple. Her scars ached in the cold air. Tanner felt it too, the tension crawling under his skin. They went straight to the sheriff. Sheriff Webb was an older man, heavy-set, a scar over one eye from a bar fight no one mentioned. He listened to Junie's story without interrupting, but when she pulled out the letters, he stiffened. "These are serious accusations," he said. "You're accusing a man of murder, of rape, of arson. They're signed," Junie whispered. "Everyone." Sheriff Webb thumbed through the letters, jaw tight. "You understand what'll happen if I move on this and the town turns against me?" Tanner stepped forward. "If you don't move on it, more women will die." The sheriff looked at Junie. "He's already here, you know. Been preaching revival at the tent outside town. Got 200 people chanting his name." Junie's hand shook. "He knows I'm here?" "Not yet," the sheriff said. "But he will soon." Tanner leaned close. "Then you need to arrest him now. Don't give him time to twist it." Webb sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I'll send men tonight. But you two stay put. And pray the town sides with you when this comes out." The storm broke by morning. Elijah Ashby was arrested in the middle of a revival sermon. People shouted, confused, angry. Some screamed that it was blasphemy. Others watched in silence, eyes wide. The sheriff stood firm, holding up the letters. Elijah didn't resist. He just smiled. That cold, knowing smile. "This won't hold," he said. "She's broken, burned. A bitter woman looking to destroy what she couldn't understand." Junie stood at the courthouse steps, watching the crowd. Some whispered, some pointed. A woman near the front wept. Tanner stood beside her. "We did what we came to do." But the fight wasn't over. The trial was set for 3 days later. And suddenly, everyone had something to say. Letters to the paper, town meetings, church protests. Rumors flew that Junie was a prostitute, a fraud, a woman who'd lied to gain attention. They said she'd seduced Elijah, that she set the fire herself out of guilt. Junie walked the streets with her bonnet pulled low. People stared, murmured. A child pointed at her face and asked his mother what wrong looked like. Tanner saw her shrinking again, bit by bit. That night they argued. "I should have stayed hidden," she said, voice trembling. "This is worse. He's turning them against me." Tanner stood across the room, fists clenched. "That's what he does. He makes you doubt. Twist yourself into something small. You let him keep that power, then he already won." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," he said, softening. "But you survived it. And that makes you stronger than he'll ever be." She turned away. "You can leave. You've done enough." Tanner stepped close. "I'm not leaving." She looked up at him, broken. "Why?" "Because I care what happens to you. Because you matter." And in that moment, her walls cracked. Just enough. She didn't cry, but she leaned against him, let herself be held for the first time without flinching. But outside, darkness moved. That night, someone threw a brick through the window of the room they were staying in. Tanner sprang to his feet, pistol drawn. Junie ducked, heart racing. The brick had a note tied to it. "Drop the case or burn again." Tanner opened the door, scanned the empty street. No one. He handed the note to the sheriff the next morning. "We'll put extra watch on the courthouse," Webb promised. But he looked tired, worn. Inside the courtroom, Elijah sat straight-backed, hands folded. He acted like a victim, like a man wronged by the world. When Junie took the stand, the air turned to glass. She told the truth. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke of the first time Elijah struck her. The time he locked her in a shed for 3 days. The things he did when no one else was home. And finally, how he tried to kill her. Tanner sat in the back, fists white. When the letters were shown, some gasped. Some wept. One woman ran out of the courtroom. Elijah's lawyer tried to break her. Asked if she had lovers. If she drank. If she was mentally sound. Junie didn't look away. Didn't flinch. The sheriff brought the letters forward. Then, something unexpected happened. A woman stood up in the back of the room. Thin, gray shawl. She raised her hand. "I wrote one of those letters," she said. Gasps. Stirring. And then another voice. And another. 3 women, each in different corners of the room, all stepping forward. Junie turned, eyes wide, tears finally falling. The judge called for order, but was already over. The truth had cracked open, and it couldn't be stuffed back into silence. Elijah was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to hang. No plea for mercy. Outside the courthouse, the town was silent. No one shouted anymore. The whispers stopped. The stares faded. Tanner took Junie's hand as they walked down the steps. She looked at the sky. It was finally clear, but she didn't smile. She just breathed. For the first time in years, fully. They had won, but the cost had been everything. The gallows were already being built when the sun rose over Elwood. Heavy timber stacked at the edge of the square, nailed by quiet men with calloused hands who didn't ask questions. No one spoke of Elijah Ashby anymore, at least not out loud. But the town buzzed with things left unsaid. People walked differently, slower, cautious, like the truth still hovered somewhere in the dust, and nobody knew which side of it they stood on. Junie stood at the window of the upstairs room where she and Tanner had been staying, watching the structure take shape. Her face, half shadowed by morning light, looked older than it had weeks ago. Not worn, sharpened. There was a clarity in her eyes now, one that scared Tanner more than the fear she used to carry. "He's going to die," she said softly. "I should feel something." Tanner sat at the small table behind her, turning a tin cup slowly in his hands. "What do you feel?" She didn't answer, just stared harder at the gallows until her jaw clenched. That afternoon, a man came to the door, dressed like a traveler, dusty coat, neat boots, hat low over his brow. Tanner didn't like him from the moment he saw him. Something in the man's eyes didn't sit right. Too still. Too polite. "I represent the Ashby family," he said. "Elijah's brother. Specifically. He asked me to speak with the lady." Junie didn't want to see him, but the man insisted he would speak only to her. Reluctantly, she stepped onto the porch while Tanner waited inside. Close enough to hear, but far enough to let her decide. "I'm not here to threaten," the man said. "I came to offer a different choice." Junie said nothing. "Elijah's death will bring you peace. I don't doubt that. But his family has resources, land, money, power. They're willing to ensure your safety, long-term, relocation, even a new name, if you agree to withdraw the letters from public record. Let the man hang, but let his legacy remain cleansed." Junie's breath hitched. "You want me to lie?" "Just silence," he said. "For your own good." She turned away, started back inside. The man called after her. "You could disappear again, or you could become someone new, but dragging this through the newspapers will only follow you." Junie didn't stop. She shut the door behind her, her shoulders shaking. Tanner stood, fists balled. "We can go to the sheriff." "No," she said, cutting him off. "No more running. No more hiding. He's going to hang, and they don't get to choose how the world remembers him. I do." The next day, reporters came. Word had gotten out. The letters had been published in part by a paper from Fort Sayer. The editor, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Clara Templeton, asked Junie if she'd be willing to speak publicly. "I want his victims remembered," Junie told her. "All of them, not just me." Tanner watched her speak, watched her stand on that courthouse step in front of town that once whispered she was a liar, and realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was changing things, and that meant people would come for her again. That night, someone slipped a note under their door. "He isn't the only one who's guilty. You think it ends here?" Tanner paced the room for hours after Junie fell asleep. There were others, men who helped cover Elijah's crimes, maybe even committed some of their own. And now that the truth was out, they'd be scrambling. He had a choice. Take Junie far away, disappear into some quiet canyon with a new name and a clean life, or stay and fight what might never end. At dawn, he sat beside her on the bed. "I can take you away from this." Junie opened her eyes. "You'd leave your land? Your home? I'd leave anything for you." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes soft. Then she said, "I don't want to hide anymore." So they stayed. The morning of the hanging came cold. The crowd was already thick by the time Tanner and Junie arrived. Elijah stood on the platform in a black coat, clean-shaven, hands tied behind his back. He looked calm, serene even, as if he knew that, in death, he might still control the story. He turned his head toward Junie in the crowd, smiled. She didn't look away. The sheriff read the sentence. The preacher murmured a few quiet words. Elijah's last words were clear, loud. "I forgive the woman who betrayed me." The trapdoor opened. The sound was sharp, final. Junie didn't flinch, but she didn't move either. Tanner kept his hand on her back, steady and warm. Afterward, the town emptied slowly. People didn't talk much. Some nodded to Junie, respectful now. Some avoided her altogether. But the letters had changed things. Other women began writing, testifying. Names came out. Men resigned from their church boards. A judge was suspended. Investigations spread into nearby towns. What Junie carried in that tin box had started something no one could stop. But that brought danger too. A week after the hanging, Clara Templeton returned. She carried news. "There's a man," she said. "Name's Clay Merrow. Used to work with Elijah. He's trying to discredit you. Claims you doctored the letters." Junie paled. "He was one of the men who delivered girls to the house. Said they were volunteers. Said it was God's work." Clara nodded. "He's running scared, but he has money and reach." Tanner stepped forward. "We'll handle him." Clara looked between them. "He won't stop. Neither will others like him." Junie's voice didn't shake this time. "Then we don't stop either." They knew then. The story wasn't over. The gallows ended Elijah, but not what he built. Tanner and Junie moved to Cedar Rock by spring. Not far, but far enough from the ashes of Elwood. They bought a small piece of land, just enough to grow something and call it theirs. Junie took a new name in town, but not to hide. She chose to start fresh. The tin box sat on their mantle, a reminder of everything they'd buried and everything they'd brought to light. Some nights, she still woke in a cold sweat, breath caught in her throat. Tanner would pull her close, hold her until she slowed. Other nights, she lay awake watching the stars, thinking of the girls whose names she'd read in silence. "They didn't die for nothing," she whispered once. Tanner kissed her temple. "Not with you carrying their truth." Their love didn't come loud. It came in slow pieces, shared coffee, quiet mornings, hands brushing as they worked. It came in laughter that finally returned to her voice. It came in peace she'd never thought she'd feel again. In town, people grew to know her as June Thatcher, a quiet, sharp woman with scars who didn't shrink under anyone's gaze. No one asked about the past, and if they guessed, they kept it to themselves. One afternoon, as they walked the fence line together, Tanner stopped and took her hand. "I never asked," he said gently. "Do you forgive him?" Junie thought for a long while. "I don't know if forgiveness is something I owe him, but I forgive myself for surviving." That was the turning point. Not Elijah's death, not the trial, but that moment when she finally let go of the guilt she'd been carrying like it was hers to hold. They stood there together, wind stirring the grass, the land wide and open in every direction. Not perfect, not healed completely, but alive, free, and finally home. Spring melted into summer, and the hills around Cedar Rock bloomed with wildflowers that swayed gently in the morning breeze. The land had a softness to it now, though nothing out here was ever truly easy. But there was something about this season that held a kind of mercy, like the earth itself was offering a second chance. That was what Junie clung to, not the justice handed down by a judge, not the clamor that followed Elijah's hanging, but the quiet mercy of mornings where no one looked at her like a ghost. The cabin Tanner built for them stood at the base of a ridge, tucked against the tree line. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, made of things they'd chosen together. Junie hung curtains she sewed herself. Tanner carved a rocking chair for the porch. They didn't speak much about the past, not unless it rose like smoke between them. And when it did, they let it settle instead of pushing it away. There was healing in that, being seen and still being loved. Junie started teaching local girls to read. One at first, then three, then six. They came from families that didn't have much, daughters of ranch hands and seamstresses. They sat in a circle under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin, books in their laps, faces scrunched in thought. Junie's voice was calm, patient, and her scars, which once made her hide, had become something the girls stopped noticing, or maybe something they quietly admired. She never told them the whole story, just enough to remind them that silence doesn't protect the truth, and that girls who survive are never weak. Tanner watched from the porch sometimes, sipping coffee with dirt still under his nails. He knew she didn't need saving. She never had. What she needed was someone who would stand still beside her while the fire passed. And that was what he'd become. One morning, a letter arrived. No return name. The envelope was worn, edges curled. Inside was a single note. I told the truth. Because you did. Thank you. No signature. Junie read it twice, then tucked it into the tin box with the others. She didn't need to know who sent it. The fact that someone out there had found the courage to speak because she had, it was enough. There were still bad days. Days when Junie's hands trembled without warning. Nights when a shout in the distance made her bolt upright in bed, eyes wild. Tanner would hold her until she remembered where she was. And in the morning, they'd go feed the chickens like nothing happened. But over time, the grip of the past loosened. She started smiling again. Not out of politeness or gratitude, but real, unguarded joy. Sometimes when she was hanging laundry. Sometimes when Tanner told a dry joke that wasn't all that funny. And sometimes just from waking up to another morning that didn't come with fear. One evening, after the girls had gone and the sun was melting behind the trees, Junie sat beside Tanner and asked, "Do you think we did the right thing? Telling the world everything." Tanner didn't answer right away. He rubbed his thumb over the ridge of her hand. The truth doesn't fix everything, but it's the only thing that leaves you clean. She nodded, looking out over the field. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I never got on that train. I do too, he said. Then I remember that you did. It was quiet for a long while after that. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Later that year, the local paper published an anniversary column about the Ashby trial. It didn't name Junie, but it spoke of the courage of a survivor who sparked a wave of testimonies across the county. It mentioned how one story had turned into dozens, and how a handful of powerful men had either vanished or been arrested in its wake. Junie read it only once, then folded the paper and slid it beneath the tin box. "It's not who I am," she said. "It's what I walked through." Tanner kissed her forehead. "That's more than most ever do." One late autumn evening, the first real snow came down over Cedar Rock. Light flakes at first, then heavy ones that settled in thick white blankets across the fields. Junie stood at the window, watching it fall. Tanner came up behind her, arms around her waist. "You ever think it'd be this quiet?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I hoped." They stayed like that for a while, the house warm, the fire crackling. No sermons in the distance. No knocking on the door. No letters nailed to church doors. Just peace, earned, not given. In town, no one called her the burned woman anymore. She was Mrs. Thatcher, the one who taught reading and sold jars of wild honey in the summer. A good neighbor, a kind listener, someone who kept her past in a box, but never let it bury her. Years later, after Tanner had carved her a small writing desk, Junie started putting her story down on paper. Not for the world to see, not for courts or papers or revenge, just for herself, just to remember the girl she'd been, the man who nearly destroyed her, and the stranger who became her home. In her final line, she wrote, "He burned my face, but not my name. That I gave myself." It wasn't a story about tragedy, not really. It was a story about what comes after, about how survival isn't a single moment, but 1,000 quiet choices. About how love doesn't heal all wounds, but it stays. It waits. It witnesses. And sometimes, when it's quiet enough, it rebuilds. One breath at a time.